The night they came, Mara Sokolova was on a rooftop watching meteors fall. She remembered the way Dasha had laughed. Throat back, unself-conscious. The kind of laugh you only hear from people who've forgotten to care what they look like. Dasha had her phone out, trying to film the shower, complaining the camera wouldn't pick up the streaks. Mara told her to just watch with her eyes. Watching with your eyes was for people who couldn't prove they'd been somewhere. That was Dasha exactly. Experience without documentation was a kind of poverty she couldn't abide. Mara loved her for it, for the whole exhausting, warm, impossible logic of her. Mara had just started to laugh when the sky opened up, not like a meteor. A meteor is a scratch on glass, gone before your mind registers it. This was different. This was deliberate. A shape, enormous and gray-white like cooling iron, shearing through the cloud cover over the eastern districts of the city, with a sound she would spend the rest of her life trying to accurately describe and always fail. Not a boom, not a roar. More like every piece of glass in a 10-kilometer radius deciding simultaneously to become aware of its own fragility. The building they were standing on swayed. Mara caught Dasha's arm. Dasha's phone fell and shattered on the roof tar. Then the building across the street came down. Not all of it. One corner, 6 floors worth, peeled away like a page from a wet book. The alien craft, though Mara didn't have that word for it yet. Her brain was still 3 seconds behind her eyes. Clipped the corner tower on its descent, shedding pieces of itself as it went, trailing blue-white plasma and chunks of something that was not metal and was not stone, and left craters in the asphalt wherever they struck. It hit the Earth 2 blocks east. The shockwave arrived 3 seconds later, and it knocked Mara clean off her feet. She hit the roof surface with her shoulder and skidded, and when she came to rest she was looking straight up at the sky, which was now full of dust and light. She crawled to where Dasha had been standing. Dasha was not there anymore. Later, she would not be able to say how much. Later, her phone had stopped working and the light was wrong, orange from the fires. Men in uniforms found her sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, staring at the smoke column rising from the crash site 2 blocks east. They told her she was in shock. She told them about Dasha. One of them wrote something in a notebook. None of them looked at her while they did it. Her father was Colonel Andrei Sokolov, Air Defense Command, one of the most competent and controlled men she'd ever known. In the first 48 hours he barely spoke to her, and she understood that without taking it personally. He was running a perimeter operation in a city that had just experienced an event with no precedent, no doctrine, no manual. He was standing in briefings where senior men argued about what to call the thing that had landed in the middle of a populated district and killed 211 people. She sat in a folding chair outside one of those rooms and listened to the muffled shape of their voices arguing through the door. And she thought about Dasha's laugh. And she did not cry because crying felt like something that could wait until she understood what had happened. And she did not understand what had happened yet. The government quarantined the crash zone within 12 hours. High fencing, military checkpoints, curfews radiating outward in concentric rings. The news channels ran the same 4 pieces of footage on continuous rotation. The initial descent captured by 3 different traffic cameras. The dust cloud expanding. A burning car on a blocked intersection. A still image of a uniformed man pointing at a tactical display. The anchors spoke with the particular careful cadence of people reading words they had been told not to question. No official statement had used the word alien yet. The preferred formulation was unidentified atmospheric vehicle. The crowds gathering at the fencing were less careful with their language. Mara heard them when she walked the perimeter on the 3rd day, without permission, in a hooded jacket she'd taken from a civilian relief supplies box. They were mostly young men. They had handmade signs and the kind of granular, contagious fury she recognized from years of watching Artyom's social circles. The ones who said the city was being stolen from them, who had been saying it for years, who had been looking for a face to put on the theft, and now at last had one. Non-human. Which was somehow worse and also, she understood, better for their purposes. A target that couldn't argue back. A grievance made visible. She didn't agree with them. But she was honest enough to understand the feeling underneath, which was simply fear that had nowhere to put itself, which was the oldest human condition of all. She went through a gap in the fence she'd identified during her walk. It wasn't guarded. The security rotation had a 12-minute gap that no one had thought to close because everyone assumed the fence itself was sufficient deterrent. She moved through the debris field in the long blue dusk of a spring evening, stepping around blackened concrete, around overturned vehicles fused to the asphalt by heat, around things she couldn't name. The ship itself, what remained of it, was visible ahead. A vast, partially collapsed structure that looked nothing like anything she'd seen in films or technical documents or anyone's imagination. Not a saucer, not a cylinder. Something more like a cathedral that had been compressed from several directions at once and retained its own internal logic regardless. Its surface had a quality that resisted description. Under the fading light, it seemed to absorb the light and then release it, fractionally delayed, as if the material had a memory. She heard movement to her left. She stopped, pressed herself behind the burned-out frame of a city bus, its windows all gone, its metal skin warped into shapes she associated with paintings rather than transport. She listened. The debris field was not quiet. There were settling sounds, creak and pop sounds, the distant mechanical noise of emergency teams working somewhere to the north. But underneath all of that, she had caught something specific, a dragging rhythm, labored, the unmistakable cadence of something wounded trying to move without being heard. She followed the sound to what had been the ground floor stairwell of an apartment block. The upper floors were gone, sheared off cleanly, but the entry corridor was intact, and in the dark of that corridor, half folded against the far wall, was the thing responsible for all of it. Her first thought, arriving before fear had time to properly assemble itself, was that it was too tall, not grotesquely, but wrong in the way of someone seen at the wrong angle, where the proportions are off by a margin that the eye keeps trying to correct. Her second thought was that it was in pain. The signal was unmistakable. Something in the hunch of its shoulders, if those were shoulders, in the way one arm was pressed against what she guessed was its torso. Pain, she understood, read the same across distances that language could not cross. She did not know anything else about it yet, but she knew that. It became aware of her. The movement was sudden, a lurch toward the corridor entrance, fast in the way of things that are faster than you expect. She stepped back and her heel caught a piece of fallen tile, and she went down hard, both hands taking the impact, palms shredded. The world tilted and she was falling backward into the open stairwell below the entry step. And then she wasn't falling anymore. A hand, wrong number of fingers, wrong proportions. The grip was sure. It held her forearm with a care that was, she thought later, almost formal, as if the act of grabbing someone to prevent their fall was a ritual it knew the rules of. She looked up. It looked back at her through whatever it was that served as its face. She could not read the expression. She was not sure expression was the right category, but she looked for fear in it and found nothing she could call that, and she looked for aggression and found nothing she could call that either, and what she found instead was something she had no word for, a quality of attention, the sustained weight-bearing look of something that has decided to see you clearly. It set her back on her feet. She ran. She came back the next morning. She told herself she was coming to look at the ship. That was a reasonable explanation. She brought food anyway, a thermos of tea, 2 pieces of bread, a small jar of something her aunt had made and left in the apartment the week before. She did not examine the impulse. She had been taught by a physics teacher she respected to write the observation before forming the interpretation. She found him in the same place, and the fact of his remaining told her something she needed to know. He was more hurt than she'd initially assessed, or he had genuinely nowhere to go, or both. He watched her approach with the same quality of attention she'd seen in the corridor. She stopped 2 meters away and held out the bread. He looked at it. He looked at her. She broke off a piece and ate it herself. Like this. This is how it works here. She was not going to pretend the communication was anything other than what it was. Tentative. Asymmetrical. Built on the narrowest shared ground. But she wasn't going to perform more uncertainty than she felt either. He took the bread, held it against what she'd decided to call his mouth, and then lowered it. He was not going to pretend to eat for her benefit. He was not going to manage her expectations in that direction. She appreciated the honesty of it. She sat on a piece of fallen concrete and took out her notebook. She had been carrying it in her jacket pocket since the start of the week. She wrote, Day 4, alive. The wounded one is still here. Not aggressive. Extended physical help without apparent calculation, or at least not the calculation I would recognize as such. Held my eyes when I looked at him. Reads as deliberate. He watched her write. There was something in the quality of the attention that reminded her of Dasha reading over her shoulder on the bus, unembarrassed about it. Genuinely curious about other people's interior lives. The memory came through her like cold water and was gone. She looked up. He was still watching. I had a friend, she said. pointlessly in Russian. She knew he didn't understand the words. She said them anyway. Her name was Dasha. She was on the roof with me when your ship came down. She paused. She had this laugh, the kind of laugh that makes you feel. She stopped. Tried again. You know how some people laugh and you think, the world is bigger than I thought because this person is in it? She had that. She looked at her hands. At the cuts on her palms, crusted now, healing ugly. I just need someone to know she existed. I know you can't understand me. But she had a name and she laughed like that, and someone should say it. Silence. The city's ambient noise. Distant machinery, the crack and settle of cooling metal. Then from him, a sound. Low, complex, structured. She felt the structure of it the same way you feel the structure of music in a language you don't speak. Without being able to name the components, but able to recognize that there are components, that it is not random. It was not an imitation of what she'd said. It was a response in kind, a different instrument playing something that answered the shape of her words without replicating them. She wrote that down too. His name, the portion of it that her mouth could approximate after 2 days of cautious phonetic mapping, compressed into something like Hevan, 2 syllables, accent on the first, and she used that. He didn't correct her, which she took as sufficient license to continue. Over the days that followed, she learned things about him, in the way you learn things about someone when language is unavailable. Through accumulated observation, through the deposit of detail that builds itself into understanding, if you're patient enough to wait for it. He was methodical. He touched nothing carelessly. Every object he examined was approached with a deliberate sequence, assessed, then placed down with precision when he was done. He moved through pain without displaying it. Only in the intervals of stillness was the wound visible. When he would stop, press that arm against his side, and breathe in a long, controlled exhale. She had confirmed by then that breathing was something his biology required. She was building a list. She brought her friend Grisha on the 5th day. Grisha was the person everyone called Google, an attribute that originated with his demonstrated ability to name every former Soviet republic in order and date of independence from memory, an ability he'd deployed exactly once at a school event, and would, she suspected, never live down. He was initially alarmed by Heaven, and then, within approximately 40 minutes, became so comprehensively absorbed in the problem that the alarm simply left the building. His brain operated faster than his nervous system's threat response. She had always found this both deeply useful and slightly concerning. Together they catalogued what of the ship remained accessible and what the military had already taken. Most of the propulsion and navigation components had been seized within the first 72 hours. The protocol, as Grisha explained it with the resignation of someone who has studied bureaucratic systems long enough to be unsurprised by their logic, was: unknown object encountered, control the object first, categorize later, justify the control in the interim. The components were now in a secured depot 10 kilometers north, her father's depot. She sat with that fact for 2 days before she did anything about it. She was not naive about what it meant to use her father's position. He was a man who had spent his career inside institutional structures that required a specific relationship with hierarchy, with the chain of accountability, with the understanding that individual moral reasoning could not be permitted to override collective protocol, or everyone's individual moral reasoning would, and the whole machinery would seize. She respected that structure even where it frustrated her. She also knew, having observed him for 22 years, that underneath the institutional man was a person who had spent 3 days teaching her to identify cloud formations when she was 7 because she'd expressed an interest, who had sat with her through the winter after her mother died without once suggesting that grief was a problem requiring a solution. She went to his office on the 8th day and sat across from him and said, "I need to talk to you about what's in the depot." He looked at her without speaking for a moment. Then, "You've been inside the perimeter, yes?" He looked at his desk. It was immaculate, organized. The desk of a man who managed his environment through order the way other people managed it through conversation. "How many times?" A pause. "Is it?" He, a longer pause. "Is he dangerous?" She considered the question as it deserved to be considered. No more than anything that's frightened and injured and can't communicate and has a city trying to kill it, which is a particular kind of dangerous. But not the kind you mean. He stood and walked to the window, which faced north in the direction of the depot, and stood there for a very long time without speaking. That evening Grisha found the workaround. Not a theft. Nothing dramatic. an administrative reclassification executed through 3 layers of entirely legitimate document routing that resulted in 4 propulsion and navigation components being transferred from a secured military depot to a university research annex for specialist examination. They used her father's departmental code to sign for the release. Her father had not told her she could. He had also not told her she couldn't. She thought about that distinction a great deal. She told him about it 2 days afterward. She sat across from him again and explained, factually, what had been done and how. He listened without moving. Then the navigation system, yes. If he can navigate, he leaves. He looked at her long. The look of a man running a calculation he has not done before and is not sure he will complete to his satisfaction. And you still. He didn't choose to be here, she said. He came in damaged, already falling before the intercept. He didn't aim for us. The crash was what happens when something the size of a building comes down in a city. She held his look steadily. He lost people too. I don't know the number, but I know that much. And we have his property locked in your depot, and there are men outside the fencing who want him dead. She paused. So yes. He was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Then he said, tell me what else you need. The riots outside the perimeter had been building since the 5th day, fed by a social media environment that was moving faster than anyone's ability to introduce friction into it. The men with signs had been joined by men with louder signs, and then by men without signs at all who were angrier than anyone. Artyom had become one of the movement's most visible faces. She saw him on 3 different news channels over 2 days. Standing on barricades in the orange jacket, with the stripe on the shoulder, the one he'd worn to every night market for the past 3 years. Shouting things about the city belonging to people who built it. She felt no anger watching him, only the particular exhaustion of watching someone use genuine pain. And his pain was genuine, she knew that. Dasha had been his friend too, possibly more than his friend. As a weapon aimed at a target that hadn't created it. It was on the 11th day that he led the group through the fence. 40 men organized, arriving at 3 in the morning through the same gap she'd been using for nearly 2 weeks. She heard them before she saw them. She and Grisha and Hevan were deep in the reassembly sequence, the propulsion core interfacing with the navigation system in a process she couldn't follow technically but could assist with practically, passing components, holding alignments, doing what hands could do in the service of an intelligence, operating on principles she didn't have the framework to fully grasp. The ship's systems were making a low harmonic sound that she felt in the cartilage of her ears. Then she heard boots on rubble. She knew the weight of that sound. She stepped into the entry of the corridor. Artyom was at the front. He had a construction flashlight that made him look, in the ruins, like a figure from something older than this story. Like a man with a torch at the entrance of something dark. He wore the orange jacket. He stopped when he saw her and said her name with the particular careful weight of someone using a word they aren't sure will hold the thing they're putting in it. She said his. She kept herself in the entrance. Step aside, he said. No. He looked at her for a long time. His 40 men shuffled and breathed behind him. The construction flashlight made its circle on the wall over her left shoulder. Dasha died, he said. As if she'd forgotten, as if she needed the reminder. I know. Her voice didn't break, which surprised her. I was there. Then how? He stopped. How are you standing there, protecting the thing that killed her? The ship hit the building, Mara said. The ship was already damaged before it crossed our atmosphere. The air defense intercept accelerated the descent. He didn't aim for us. He was falling. She paused. You know this. The records are public. You've read them and chosen not to believe them because it's easier to be angry at something you can see standing in front of you. His face moved. She watched pain travel across it. Not new pain, the same pain that had been there since the night of the crash, just briefly visible. The same pain she'd been carrying for 11 days, pointed in a different direction. Let me do what I came here to do, he said, very quietly. I can't, she said. He stepped forward. What happened next happened faster than she processed in the moment. Heaven came past her, one fluid sequence, wrong proportions and all, the particular speed of a biology operating on parameters she'd documented but not yet internalized. He placed himself between Mara and the 40 men and stood still. He made no threatening gesture. He raised nothing. He simply stood in the beam of the flashlight and allowed himself to be seen. All of him. The height, the proportions, the material covering him that moved in that untrackable peripheral way. The arm still pressed against his side. The thing she'd learned to recognize as his face, angled slightly downward so that the flashlight caught it fully. standing with nothing between himself and 40 angry men, except the willingness to be seen. The flashlight beam moved across him slowly. She heard movement in the group, shuffling, a compressed exhale. Then from somewhere at the back a sound she didn't immediately recognize. Low, not language. She understood after a moment that it was a man weeping quietly, the way people weep when they're trying not to. Artyom stood very still. 30 seconds, perhaps more. The flashlight remained on heaven. Mara watched Artyom's face in the reflected light. Watched him run the calculation that she'd been running for 11 days. The one that kept coming back to the same answer, no matter how many times you reset it. He lowered the flashlight. He did not turn around. He stood with the light at his side and looked at the ground near his feet. And what drained out of his posture was not the grief. The grief stayed. The grief was going to stay for a long time. But the kinetic energy of the anger, the forward pressure that had carried 40 men through a gap in a fence at 3 in the morning. "What do you want?" he said, flat, genuinely asking. "To give him back his seating system," Mara said. "To give him enough time to make the repairs. And then to let him leave. And then he just leaves." "Yes." Artyom was quiet. She could see his jaw working. "Dash just died," he said. "Yes," she said, and there was nothing to add to that. She didn't try. He stood for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come, and after a pause that felt uncertain, the 40 men followed. She let out a breath that had been in her chest since she'd stepped into the corridor entrance. And it came out slightly shaky at the end, and she was grateful no one saw it. Grisha appeared at her shoulder. "That went significantly better than my baseline prediction," he said. She didn't answer. She was watching the last of the flashlights disappear into the debris field, watching the dark filth back in behind them, feeling the specific ringing quality that remains in the air after something that might have been catastrophic decides not to be. They worked through what remained of the night. The propulsion core interfaced fully with the navigation array at 9:47 in the morning. She knew the exact time because every fragment of glass in the debris field rattled simultaneously, and because Grisha, who had been documenting the sequence, called out the timestamp in a voice that was trying very hard to be professionally neutral and not quite making it. The ship produced a low subsonic resonance. The air pressure changed. A dog somewhere outside the fence started barking and did not stop for a long time. She walked with Heaven through the debris field to the ship's hull. She'd learned the entry point by now, learned to read enough of the ship's surface logic to find it without being shown. She walked with him and did not speak because she had said what she needed to say, and she did not want to fill silence with less. He stopped at the entrance and turned. She hadn't expected that. She'd thought departure was departure, a thing that moved in one direction and did not pause. He reached into the material of his covering and produced something small, flat. She might have called it glass, but glass was wrong. It had a different relationship with light, a depth that glass didn't have. On its surface, something moved. She stared until her visual system parsed it. Stars, not an image, actual positions in real time, distances plotting and updating as she watched. A map, live, calibrated to wherever they were standing in the universe at this specific moment. He held it toward her. She took it, felt the weight of it, which was almost nothing, looked up at him. He made a sound, brief, 2 syllables. She had been learning his sounds for 11 days, and she did not have words for most of them, but the second syllable of this one landed on her with the structure of a question, not a request, not a demand. A question offered openly to which any answer would be accepted. She closed her fingers around the map. "I know," she said, though she couldn't have explained precisely what she knew. She knew something. The knowing had the texture of something she'd been working toward for 11 days without being able to name the direction. He held her eyes for one more moment, long, with the same quality she'd noticed in the very first corridor. The weight-bearing attention of something that had decided to see you clearly and was following through on that decision to the end. Then he went inside. The hull sealed behind him. She stood in the debris field and watched the ship rise. It was quieter than she'd expected. Not the drama of the descent, not the catastrophic noise of arrival. A subsonic hum felt more than heard, and then the ship simply climbed, ascending through the pale morning in a long, clean arc, leaving behind an absence that took her several seconds to process as silence. She watched until there was nothing to watch. Then she kept standing there because the standing felt like the right thing to continue doing for a while. Grisha came up beside her. He had his notebook open and was looking at it without reading it. "I've been thinking about what he was," he said eventually. "His actual function. not what the briefings will call him. What do you think? A surveyor, Grisha said. Or whatever word they use. Someone whose job is to go somewhere new and understand it before anyone else does. Not a soldier, not a diplomat, someone who wanted to know. He paused. He came here alone, or nearly. He wasn't built for what happened to him and he stopped. He still stood in front of 40 men and didn't do anything except let them look at him, Mara said. Yes, she thought about that. About what it cost, to stand visible and weaponless in front of something that wants to harm you, trusting that the act of being seen clearly will be enough. The particular human courage of it, except it wasn't human, which was the point, which was the thing she kept arriving at and would keep arriving at for a long time. He trusted us, she said quietly, more than we trusted ourselves. Grisha was quiet for a moment. That's either the most humbling thing I've ever heard, he said, or the most devastating. She opened her hand and looked at the map. Still live, still plotting. The stars repositioned marginally since she'd first looked, the tiny incremental drift of real time. She watched them move for a while. Behind her, the city was waking up. The barriers would begin to come down today or the day after. The curfews would lift incrementally. The news channels would begin the long, difficult work of deciding how to name what had happened. Not the crash landing. That part had names already, but the other part. The part that didn't fit the story they'd been telling for 11 days. The part where a young woman with cuts on her palms went back morning after morning and sat with the wounded thing in the ruined corridor and offered it bread and said her dead friend's name out loud into the silence because someone should. The part where 40 angry men stood in the ruins at 3 in the morning and then turned around and walked away. That part might not be named for a long time. That part might not have a name that fit comfortably on a news broadcast or a signed document. She didn't need it named. She knew what it was. She pocketed the map and turned and walked back through the debris field in the morning light, stepping carefully over rubble, her shadow long ahead of her. The ringing quality in the air was fading now, the particular resonance of aftermath dissolving into the ordinary texture of a city, finding its way back to its own rhythm. She thought about Dasha. She let herself think about Dasha fully, for the first time, without the bracing efficiency of crisis pushing the thought into a corner. The laugh. The phone she'd been holding when the sky opened up. The way she'd pressed tickets into Mara's hands for a concert they were never going to attend. And the way doing that had felt. Like an ordinary kindness. Unmemorable. The kind you never think to remember until the person isn't there to receive the next one. She said the name out loud, once, to the morning, to the debris field, and the pale sky and whatever was out there beyond it. Then she kept walking. Above her, the sky was very large and very old, and full of distances she would not cover in her lifetime. She did not look up at it. She already knew what was out there. Something that had stood in front of 40 men with but its own willingness to be seen, and trusted it would be enough. It had been enough. She did not go directly home. She walked the long way, through the outer zone of the curfew perimeter, where civilians were now permitted to gather and observe from behind the secondary barrier. The crowd here was different from the fence crowd she'd seen days ago. Quieter, older, people who'd come to look rather than to protest. A woman in her 60s stood with a thermos of coffee, watching the smoke that still rose, thin now, from the center of the crash zone. A man in a school-aged child's winter jacket held the child on his shoulders so the child could see. An elderly man with a cane stood perfectly still, just watching, the way old men sometimes watch things, as if watching were a form of participation equal to any other. She stopped beside the woman with the thermos. "My nephew lives in that building," the woman said without preamble. Without looking at Mara, she gestured toward the residential tower visible beyond the secondary fence, its lower floors still intact, its upper facade damaged. "He's staying with us now. He keeps asking when he can go home." Mara didn't know what to say. "I tell him soon," the woman continued. "I don't know if that's true, but it's what you say." "It might be true," Mara offered. The woman looked at her sideways. "You've been in there." It wasn't an accusation, more like recognition. Mara didn't answer directly. "I think it's going to be okay," she said. I think it was an accident. The whole thing, the coming here, the damage, an accident." The woman considered this, poured a cup from her thermos and held it out. Mara took it. "My mother used to say," the woman said, "that the most dangerous thing in the world is an accident that looks like an intention, because then everyone starts responding to the intention that isn't there, and they make real damage out of imaginary malice." Mara sipped the coffee. It was very hot and sweet and tasted like someone's grandmother, which in this context was a flavor that hit in a way she wasn't prepared for. "Your mother was right," she said. The woman took back the cup when Mara offered it. "Go home, girl. Get some sleep. You look like you've been carrying something heavy." Mara thought about saying she had. She thought about what, specifically. She decided that some things were carried silently for a while before they could be put down out loud. She said good night and walked home. Her father was awake when she arrived. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of tea he wasn't drinking, in the way of someone who has come to a room for company rather than for tea. He looked up when she came in, and his face went through something briefly. Not worry, exactly. Something with more relief in it than worry. She sat down across from him. For a while neither of them said anything. That was not unusual between them. They had always had a talent for productive silence, the kind that fills itself without either person needing to direct it. "The Deepet reclassification," he said eventually. "Yes." The ministry called. He wrapped both hands around the glass. They noticed the signature. She waited. "I told them it was a pre-authorized operational decision made under emergency protocol and that I stood by it." He paused. "There will be a review process." "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. He shook his head, not dismissing the apology, just indicating its weight wasn't in the right place. "I've been standing in front of review processes since before you were born. I know how to stand in front of one." He looked at her. Tell me it was worth it." She thought about the strip of sky she'd watched through the gap in the collapsed corridor roof, about the harmonic sound of the propulsion core coming online, about Hevon standing in a flashlight beam with 40 men looking at him and doing nothing except standing. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He picked up his tea and drank some of it. She recognized in him what she sometimes recognized in herself. The adjustment, the internal recalibration that occurs when something you thought you knew has shifted in a fundamental way, and you are deciding what to build in its place. He was a surveyor, she said, using Grisha's word, which had felt true when Grisha said it and felt truer now. "That's my reading of him. Someone whose work is to go somewhere and understand it." Her father looked at the table. "That's an expensive line of work. Most of the work worth doing is." He almost smiled at that. She watched him almost smile and felt something ease in her chest that had been held for 11 days. She went to bed eventually, still wearing the civilian jacket, and slept without difficulty, which surprised her. She'd expected dreams. She got instead the deep, uncomplicated sleep of a body that has been running past its capacity for a long time, and has finally been given permission to stop. In the morning she found the map on her bedside table where she'd placed it before sleeping. Still live, still updating. The positions of stars shifted fractionally from the night before in the small, honest arithmetic of real motion. She held it and watched it for a while. She thought about the question Heaven had asked. The 2 syllables, the second one with the structure of an inquiry. And she thought about what she'd answered and whether the answer had been correct. She thought yes, probably yes, as much as you could know across that distance. She got up and made tea and opened the window and looked at the sky, which was overcast, which was ordinary, which was Moscow in spring. The smoke from the crash site was completely gone now. The air tasted like any other morning. Grisha called at 9. "I've been writing up the observational notes," he said. "The ones from the whole 11 days. What are you going to do with them?" A pause. "I don't know yet. I think they need to sit for a while before they become anything. Some things." He stopped. "Some things take time to be safe enough to be public. The information is real. The information is important, but the way it lands depends on when you drop it." "Yes," she said. "There's a physicist at the university," Grisha continued, "in the astrophysics department. She's been making carefully phrased public statements for the past week about the composition of the debris samples that the military released for civilian analysis, carefully phrased in a specific direction." "What direction?" "The direction of, this is propulsion technology we have no analog for, and rather than reverse engineering it for military application, which would take us approximately 200 years, we might consider what it implies about physics, as we currently understand it, and revise accordingly." He paused. "I think I'd like to talk to her." Mara looked at the map in her hand, at the stars still moving their tiny incremental distances in real time. "I think that's a good idea," she said. She put the map down on the windowsill so the light could move across it. She thought about what the woman with the thermos had said, about accidents that get mistaken for intentions, and the real damage that piles up in response to imaginary malice. She thought about 40 men who had walked back through a gap in a fence, because something had stood in the dark and let itself be seen. And the seeing had been enough. Not always. She was not naive enough to think it would be enough next time, or the time after that. Fear was old and adaptive and would find new shapes. That was the other human condition, the one less celebrated, the speed at which terror learns to wear a new face. But this time, this once, seeing had been enough. She drank her tea. Outside, the city was fully awake now. She could hear the trams, the delivery trucks, the particular texture of a place, resuming its ordinary life with the determination of something that does not permit disruption to be permanent. Cities were good at that. People were good at that. It was not the most glamorous of human qualities. The sheer bull-headed insistence on normalcy, but standing in her kitchen, on the 12th morning, she thought it might be one of the most important ones. She picked up her notebook, the one she'd carried to the crash site every day. The one with 11 days of observations written in the careful handwriting of someone trained to note the data before forming the interpretation. She turned to a clean page. She wrote, Day 12, he's gone. The sky is ordinary. Dasha's name is Dasha. The map is still updating. She paused, pen over the page. Then she wrote, We were trusted more than we trusted ourselves. That's either a debt or a beginning. I intend to treat it as a beginning. She closed the notebook. She put on her shoes. She went outside into the ordinary morning, into the tram sounds and the truck sounds, and the sound of the city insisting on its own continuation, and she walked north, toward the university, toward the physicist Grisha had mentioned, toward whatever conversation needed to begin next. The map stayed on the windowsill, tracking its distances, indifferent and faithful, waiting for the moment she came back.